The world knew Eddie Van Halen as a guitar god who revolutionized rock music with techniques that seemed impossible. But behind the legendary solos and groundbreaking innovations lay a secret so profound it would redefine everything we thought we knew about musical genius. Eddie Van Halen couldn't read music, not a single note. Yet somehow, this Dutch immigrant boy won classical piano competitions, mastered complex compositions, and created guitar techniques that trained musicians spent decades trying to decode. The question that haunted music teachers, fellow musicians, and fans for years was deceptively simple. How did he do it? The answer reveals a story of childhood survival, desperate adaptation, and a mind that processed music in ways neuroscience is only now beginning to understand. If you're fascinated by the untold stories behind rock's greatest legends, hit that subscribe button now. We're diving deep into the secrets that shaped music history, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The year was 1965, and in a modest home in Pasadena, California, a 10-year-old Dutch boy sat at an upright piano, staring at sheet music that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Eddie Van Halen had been taking classical piano lessons for 3 years, ever since his family emigrated from the Netherlands in 1962. His father, Jan Van Halen, was a classically trained musician himself, a clarinet and saxophone player who understood the European tradition of formal musical education. In the old country, musical literacy was essential, a mark of cultural sophistication. But what Jan didn't know, what Eddie himself would hide for years, was that his younger son possessed a mind that simply refused to process written musical notation the way it was supposed to. While his older brother Alex dutifully learned to read the dots and lines on the staff, Eddie's brain was operating on an entirely different frequency, one that would eventually revolutionize rock guitar, but that, in those early years, felt like a shameful deficiency that had to be concealed at all costs. The piano teacher's name was Mrs. Stasny, and she ran her studio with the rigid discipline common to classical instruction in that era. Lessons followed a predictable pattern. She would demonstrate a piece, usually something from the standard repertoire of Bach or Mozart, and then the student would attempt to reproduce it from the sheet music. For most students, this was the entire point, learning to translate those abstract symbols into sounds. But Eddie had discovered something during his very first lessons, something he instinctively knew would get him in trouble if anyone found out. When Mrs. Stasny played a piece, Eddie wasn't looking at the music. He was watching her hands. His eyes tracked every movement, every finger placement, every subtle shift of her wrists. And more than that, his ears were recording everything. Not just the notes, but the rhythm, the dynamics, the emotional inflection of each phrase. By the time she finished her demonstration, Eddie had already memorized the entire piece. Not through conscious effort, not through deliberate study, but through a kind of photographic and auditory absorption that happened automatically, almost involuntarily. The deception began innocently enough. When Mrs. Stasny asked Eddie to play from the sheet music, he would position himself at the piano, glance at the page to maintain the illusion, and then simply reproduce what he had just heard and seen. His fingers found the keys with uncanny accuracy, and the music that emerged was note-perfect. Mrs. Stasny praised his progress. She told Jan Van Halen that his son was a natural, that he had wonderful musicality. What she didn't realize was that Eddie had no idea what those black dots on the page actually meant. He couldn't tell you which note corresponded to which line or space. He didn't understand key signatures or time signatures in the traditional sense. He was operating entirely on memory and instinct, and the longer this went on, the more elaborate the deception became. But the secret couldn't last forever. And what happened when Eddie finally discovered the guitar would reveal why his inability to read music wasn't a disability. It was the key to his genius. Eddie lived in constant fear of being discovered. What if Mrs. Stasny asked him to play something cold without demonstrating it first? What if she tested his sight-reading ability? The anxiety was crushing for a boy already struggling with the trauma of immigration and cultural displacement. At school, Eddie and Alex faced relentless bullying because of their accents, their Dutch names, their status as outsiders. Kids would mock their pronunciation, call them names, sometimes physically assault them in the schoolyard. For Eddie, the piano studio became another battlefield, another place where his differentness might be exposed and punished. He developed elaborate strategies to avoid situations where his secret might be revealed. If Mrs. Stasny suggested trying a new piece, Eddie would claim he needed to practice the current one more. If she started discussing musical theory, he would nod along, memorizing the words without understanding their technical meaning, learning to fake comprehension the same way he faked reading music. The competitions were the highest stakes of all. Jan Van Halen, proud of his musical heritage and eager to see his sons succeed in America, entered Eddie in local and regional piano competitions. These weren't casual recitals, but serious classical music contests where young pianists competed for recognition and scholarships. Eddie would prepare for weeks, listening to his assigned pieces over and over, absorbing every nuance until the music became part of his muscle memory. On competition day, he would sit at the grand piano in front of judges who represented everything he feared: musical authority, technical expertise, the power to expose him as a fraud. The sheet music would be placed before him, and Eddie would begin to play, his eyes occasionally glancing at the page to maintain the performance of literacy, while his hands and ears guided him through passages he had internalized so completely that they felt like they had always been part of him. And he won. Not always, but often enough that his reputation grew. Eddie Van Halen, the young classical pianist with remarkable musicality and emotional depth. What the judges heard as artistic interpretation was actually something else entirely: a mind processing music through pure pattern recognition and emotional intuition. The breaking point came not from exposure but from revolution. In 1964, the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and like millions of American kids, Eddie and Alex watched transfixed by something that seemed to bypass all the formal rules their father represented. This was music that projected an energy classical training seemed designed to suppress. Alex immediately gravitated toward the drums. But for Eddie, it was the guitar that became an obsession. Not because he understood it technically, but because the guitar seemed to offer something the piano never had: the possibility of personal expression without the mediation of written notation. Rock guitarists didn't perform with sheet music stands in front of them. They played from feeling, from instinct, from some internal source that Eddie recognized because it was exactly how he had always processed music. Jan Van Halen was skeptical. In the European classical tradition, the guitar was seen as a lesser instrument. But the boys were persistent, and eventually Jan relented. Eddie initially took the drums while Alex claimed the guitar. Within weeks, it became clear that Eddie's natural coordination made him the better drummer, while Alex's aggressive personality suited the guitar. So they switched. It was a seemingly minor decision that would change rock music history. Because when Eddie Van Halen picked up the guitar for real, he brought to it something no formally trained guitarist possessed: a mind completely unencumbered by conventional musical literacy, free to reimagine the instrument from first principles. The guitar became Eddie's laboratory of sound. Without the ability to read tablature or standard notation, he had to figure everything out by ear, by experimentation. When he wanted to reproduce a riff he heard on a record, he couldn't look up the tabs. He had to listen dozens, sometimes hundreds of times, isolating the guitar parts through focused attention, then physically searching for the notes on his own instrument. This process developed something in Eddie that formerly trained guitarists rarely possessed: an absolutely perfect ear for pitch and tone, combined with a deep understanding of the physical mechanics of sound production. He didn't think about music theory in the abstract. He thought about where to place his fingers to create specific emotional effects. And then came the breakthrough that would change rock guitar forever, a technique born directly from those childhood piano lessons where Eddie watched instead of reading. It was tapping that revealed the true power of Eddie's musical illiteracy. The two-hand tapping technique that would make him famous, using both hands on the fretboard to create rapid, cascading note sequences, didn't come from studying advanced guitar pedagogy. It came from watching his piano teacher's hands all those years ago. Eddie remembered how Mrs. Stasny's fingers would dance across the piano keys, both hands working independently to create complex textures. One day in the garage in Pasadena, probably around 1974, Eddie had a simple thought. What if I used both hands on the guitar fretboard the way a pianist uses both hands on the keyboard? He began using his right hand to tap notes on the fretboard, while his left hand performed traditional fretting, and the sounds that emerged were unlike anything in rock music at that time. It was fluid, melodic, and percussive all at once. The recording of the first Van Halen album in 1977 at Sunset Sound Studios represented Eddie's highest-stakes performance yet. Producer Ted Templeman would discuss arrangements, suggest changes, communicate using the standard vocabulary of professional musicians. And Eddie would nod, absorb, translate everything Templeman said into his own internal system. When Templeman said, "Let's try that section in a different key," Eddie heard it not as theoretical instruction but as "move everything until it feels right." When Templeman discussed chord progressions, Eddie was thinking about finger patterns and tonal relationships, not Roman numeral analysis. Eruption, the track that would become Eddie's signature, happened almost by accident. It was essentially Eddie's warm-up routine, the exercises he would play before Van Halen's club shows. Templeman heard Eddie running through this material and immediately recognized its potential. "We should record that," he said. Eddie was reluctant. To him, it was just messing around. But they captured it in one take. 102 seconds of Eddie playing without any written music, without any premeditation beyond the muscle memory he had been developing since childhood. The tapping section that begins around the 1 minute 20 mark came from a mind that had never been constrained by conventional notation. Eddie wasn't thinking about music theory. He was thinking about making the guitar sound like multiple instruments, creating polyphonic complexity he remembered from Mrs. Stasny's piano demonstrations. When the album was released in February 1978, the guitar community's response was almost violent in its intensity. Players who had spent years mastering traditional technique couldn't understand what they were hearing. Some insisted Eddie must have overdubbed multiple guitar tracks. Others thought there was studio trickery involved. A few even accused him of fraud, claiming no human could play that fast with that clarity. Eddie found the reaction both amusing and validating. For years, he had feared being exposed as someone who couldn't read music. Now, professional musicians were accusing him of faking his guitar playing because it sounded too advanced to be real. The secret that had caused him so much childhood anxiety had become his superpower. But the music industry wasn't designed for people like Eddie. And as Van Halen became more successful, his secret would create problems nobody anticipated. The pressure to collaborate with formally trained musicians exposed the fault lines in Eddie's approach. As Van Halen signed with Warner Brothers and began working on their second album, the label started suggesting collaborations with other artists. These situations terrified Eddie in ways that performing for thousands of fans never did. In studio sessions with trained musicians, there would be discussions of chord charts, talk of key changes, references to musical theory that everyone except Eddie understood as a common language. He developed strategies to hide his illiteracy. If someone asked, "What key is that riff in?" Eddie would play it on his guitar instead of answering verbally. If a producer wanted to discuss an arrangement, Eddie would say, "Just let me show you," and demonstrate rather than engaging in theoretical conversation. The Michael Jackson Beat It collaboration in 1982 brought this tension to a crisis point. When producer Quincy Jones called Eddie and asked him to play a solo on a pop track, Eddie initially thought it was a prank and hung up. When Jones called back and convinced him it was legitimate, Eddie agreed. But the session itself was nightmarish for Eddie in ways nobody involved understood. Jones's studio was full of top-tier session musicians with formal training from Berklee and Juilliard. When Eddie arrived, there were discussions of the song's structure, the chord progression, the key modulation. Eddie absorbed this information his own way, by listening to the track repeatedly, by feeling where the solo should go emotionally rather than understanding it theoretically. When he finally tracked his solo, he did it in one take, improvising while the other musicians watched in awe and confusion. The solo became one of the most famous guitar moments in pop history. But Eddie never really understood what chord he was soloing over in the formal sense. He just knew what sounded right. The irony is that Eddie's approach, pure instinct and emotional response, unfiltered by theoretical knowledge, is exactly what made it so effective. Formally trained guitarists might have analyzed the progression and chosen theoretically appropriate scales, creating a solo that was technically correct but emotionally calculated. Eddie just played what he felt, and because his ear was so refined from years of learning everything by sound, what he felt happened to be musically perfect. But the experience reinforced Eddie's sense of being an imposter who had somehow stumbled into success despite lacking fundamental skills that real musicians possessed. By the time Wolfgang Van Halen joined the band in 2006, replacing Michael Anthony on bass, Eddie's relationship with his musical illiteracy had evolved into something like acceptance. Wolfgang represented a different generation with access to online tutorials and YouTube lessons. But Eddie's teaching method with his son was revealing. He didn't use notation or formal instruction. He would play something, and Wolfgang would reproduce it, learning the same way Eddie had learned, through observation and auditory absorption. When they jammed together in Eddie's home studio, their interaction was purely sonic. Eddie would play a riff, Wolfgang would respond with a bass line, and they would build arrangements through intuitive call and response. What Eddie discovered in teaching Wolfgang was that his approach wasn't a disability. It was simply a different form of musical intelligence. Neuroscience research has since confirmed what Eddie experienced instinctively. The brain processes music through multiple pathways, and literacy in musical notation is only one of them. Studies of musicians who learn primarily by ear show enhanced development in areas related to auditory processing and pattern recognition. Eddie's childhood adaptation had forced his brain to develop these alternative pathways to an extreme degree. His photographic memory for hand movements, his ability to remember complex pieces after hearing them once, his instinctive understanding of which positions produced which emotional effects. These weren't compensations for a disability. They were specialized capabilities that most formally trained musicians never develop. So did Eddie Van Halen succeed, despite not being able to read music, or because of it? The answer seems clear. The inability to read notation forced Eddie to develop alternative pathways that became the foundation of his innovation. Every adaptation he made as a child, the visual memorization, the intense auditory focus, the experimental learning, translated directly into the techniques that made him famous. The two-hand tapping came from watching piano hands. The brown sound came from experimental electronics. The emotional directness came from processing music as pure sound and feeling rather than abstract concepts. If Eddie had been a fluent sight reader, he almost certainly would have become a very good guitarist. But he wouldn't have become Eddie Van Halen, the player who reimagined what the electric guitar could do by approaching it from outside the traditional framework. The tragedy is that Eddie never fully believed this himself. Until his death on October 6, 2020, he maintained a kind of imposter syndrome, convinced he was somehow faking it, that real musicians knew things he didn't. He never understood that the thing he was ashamed of was precisely what made him special. Those childhood piano competitions weren't frauds. They were early expressions of a genuine musical genius that simply operated through different mechanisms than conventional training recognized. Rock history is full of self-taught musicians, but Eddie's story is unique because he actively hid his illiteracy, treating it as a shameful secret rather than an alternative approach. His career is proof that musical genius isn't about reading notation or understanding theory in the abstract. It's about having ears that hear possibilities, hands that can manifest those possibilities, and a mind that can imagine sounds that don't exist yet. Eddie had all of those qualities in abundance. What he didn't have was the ability to decode black dots on a staff. And in the end, that didn't matter at all, except to Eddie himself, who carried the weight of that childhood secret until the day he died, never quite believing that what made him different was what made him great.